Two guys heard about this grave outside a cemetery fence, and then they uncovered its dark history. But before we start, please give the video a like and make sure to subscribe to Wonderbot and hit the bell so you'll never miss any uploads from us. When they were growing up, two now middle-aged Minnesota men heard a tale about a gravesite located just outside the boundaries of a local cemetery. The boys' fathers would recount this unsettling story, which would haunt them long until their adult lives. Then one day they decided to go in search of the grisly truth and the real reason why someone came to be buried just beyond the graveyard. And realizing that they couldn't change the sad history surrounding the grave, they nevertheless wanted to make a change to how the story ended. Les and Keith Bergquist grew up in the small city of Dassel in Meeker County, Minnesota, close to the Steelsville Cemetery, which was originally intended for the dead of the area's Lutheran Swedish immigrant community. Growing up in such close proximity to a burial ground is enough to creep a lot of kids out, but it was the story that their dad told them about an unmarked grave that really disturbed the brothers. It was a yarn their old man had heard from his own father, and one that had echoed through Dassel for almost 100 years. As the tale goes, a grief-stricken father had bundled his recently deceased son's body into a wagon and taken him to the cemetery. There he dug a grave outside its fence and unceremoniously dumped the body into it. That would be the boy's final resting place. But why hadn't the mysterious man laid the beloved son to rest in a dignified burial spot with a headstone and a proper funeral? Why was the grave located outside the cemetery's perimeter with no grave marker in sight? These questions nagged at the brothers when they recalled the tale as adults, so they decided to seek some substance to the story and find some answers. Their search took Les to the Dassel Area Historical Society. It was there that he found a 100-year-old copy of the local newspaper, the Dassel Anchor, containing exactly what he was looking for. In it was a story that recounted the tale his dad had told the brothers, but with some additional grim and rather extraordinary details. The news report, dated September 7, 1911, told of how a young local blacksmith named Johann August Lundberg had barged into a neighbor's kitchen in Dassel on October 31st of that year. Reportedly, Lundberg was looking out of sorts and wasn't wearing any shoes. According to the story, he looked wild and disheveled. The 34-year-old blacksmith demanded a revolver from Mrs. Benson, the lady of the house, who was working in the kitchen. When she said she didn't have one, Lundberg instead asked for another kind of gun. A terrified Mrs. Benson bolted upstairs and from an open window called to her son, who was outside. Mrs. Benson's son ran into the house and upstairs to get his mom. Lundberg had found a gun and began loading it. Mother and son hurried outside and ran to where Mr. Benson was toiling away in the barn. There the three remained holed up until 5:30 p.m. when the local sheriff appeared on scene. Upon entering the Bensons' kitchen, the sheriff spotted Lundberg in a bedroom through a partially open door. Waiting for his chance to surprise and overpower the gunman should he turn away from the lawman, the sheriff hung back. But instead, Lundberg pointed the gun at himself and fired. It was reported that Lundberg drank heavily and was broke. With no wife and no money, he was, in the words of the Dassel Anchor, unable to buy the stuff for which he craved. Lundberg had reached breaking point, which was when he stormed into the Bensons' home. But more interesting than the story itself was the insensitivity of the language used to report it. The Dassel Anchor went on to report, "It appears that Lundberg became insane in the middle of the night and had an idea that his brother Carl was after him with the force of men, meaning to take his life. And in a fit of temporary insanity, the maniac placed the gun to his head and pulled the trigger." The newspaper report supported the story the Bergquists were told growing up, but its verbiage also painted a vivid picture of the limited understanding of mental health in the early 20th century. And it went some way toward explaining why the troubled Lundberg had been buried outside the cemetery fence. In the early 1900s, it was not unusual for Christian churches to refuse the burial of suicide victims in their cemeteries. With little understanding of depression and other mental illnesses, it was widely believed that such conditions and the act of taking your own life were the result of being literally possessed by demons. Such was the strength of these beliefs in those unenlightened times that suicide victims were not permitted to be buried in consecrated ground. It was thought that the demons of the possessed would contaminate the souls of the others buried in the cemetery. There were depressingly ignorant and intolerant attitudes surrounding mental health at the time. It was therefore left to Lundberg's father to bury his son in a makeshift grave, literally outcast from his own community. Lundberg Sr. had been widowed only a year before his son took his own life. So here he was, just a little over 12 months later, back at the graveyard, but this time performing a far less formal interment. The story resonated strongly with Les and Keith Bergquist. Although they couldn't change the events that had happened, and there was no way there would be a happy ending for the story, perhaps they could add a more dignified postscript. With a greater understanding of mental health issues in this day and age, the brothers felt Lundberg deserved more respect. Keith, who happens to be vice president of the Steelsville Cemetery Association, secured a grant from the local Meeker Cooperative Light and Power Association, which paid for a gravestone to honor Johann August Lundberg. The marker was engraved with his name and his birth and death dates and set near his burial spot. Almost 100 years to the day since Lundberg took his own life, he had his own gravestone inside the cemetery fence. It was also in sight of a vacant position within his family's plot, which contains his mother and father. It's believed this would have been Lundberg's rightful resting place under different circumstances. Lundberg also received a dedication ceremony weeks after his gravestone was installed, and a Christian ceremony courtesy of the local Gethsemane Lutheran Church. In attendance was Karen Oberg, who's lived in Benson's old house with her husband Keith since 1999. Karen described bizarre sensations and odd goings-on in the house even before she knew of its grisly history. However, since the service, Karen, a very spiritual person, has felt much more at peace in the home. No surviving relatives of Lundberg have been traced by the time of the ceremony, but nonetheless some 30 well-wishers attended the event in September 2011, 1 century on from the original burial, almost to the day. Among their number was Les, who said, "It's kind of fulfilling to see it come to a close. It's kind of breathtaking to know what happened 100 years ago tomorrow."